Thank you very much for coming to listen. A few familiar faces and a few not so. So, Shield Therapeutics. If I give you a little tour de force, just as a reminder, please all digest fully, and there's just a couple of analysts in the room. So, okay, so we are an AIM-listed biotech company. The ticker is STX. Market capitalization somewhere in the region of £60 million, so relatively small sized business at the moment, with a primary focus on developing and commercializing our lead asset, Ferrocru, which I'll obviously come on to a little bit more. But in summary, it's a novel oral therapy for the treatment of iron deficiency, which is an enormous market and largely underserved. Out-licensed already to a commercial partner in Europe with Norgine, so a company of about 1,200 people. Sales last year of around about 400 million, about 600 people in the field. So a company that has a size that for which Ferrocru is an important asset for them. In the US, we are heading down the route of an NDA, so filed in September with the PDUFA date at the end of July. And that's just, as anybody knows who's been involved with the FDA, it's just an iterative process. And an additional asset, PT20, which is complementary to Ferrocru in that it's a treatment for hyperphosphatemia, with anemia being a significant issue in chronic kidney disease patients, and that requires one more pivotal trial. So, pretty small business from a headcount perspective. From a cost base, we're about 15 people. Largely very experienced people, with all of the heavy lifting outside of the intellectual development of the business being done by vendors. We recently, with the Norgine deal, sorted out our cash position through into 2020 with an £11 million upfront from a European Union licensing. I'm sure those of you who've watched the business will have seen the travails we've been through over the last 12 months. So we had a very strange situation where some data had to be announced that was just data, not information, and of course the market reacted the way the market tends to react. So we had a precipitous fall in our share price. Actually, it was an erroneous, I won't go into the detail right now, but it proved to be an erroneous piece of data, but the damage got done. It led to a significant change in strategy for the business. Which led us from going through a planned self-commercialization of Ferrocru in Europe and the US to an out-licensing strategy. We've done a whole range of things through that year that didn't really lead to a significant rebalancing of the share price, although it's starting to take effect now with all the activities we've done, and there's been a pretty positive response through 2019 to date. A couple of things we did, for example, obviously we filed the NDA for Ferrocru, so that really put to bed any issues around the concerns around this initial top-line data that came out, because if there was a real concern, FDA would have just said, no, go and do another study. And we also fundamentally changed the approval for the drug in Europe from a treatment for iron deficiency anemia in a subset population which is effectively patients with inflammatory bowel disease, to treatment of iron deficiency in adults. So it turned it from a treatment product effectively to a prevention product, because if you treat the iron deficiency, you prevent the anemia. Okay, so what is iron deficiency, and then on to anemia. So iron deficiency, most common form of anemia. Obviously, iron is required for a whole range of vital functions, and in fact, the anemia is the end result of all the problems. So the body highly conserves iron for production of red cells. So by the time the patient is anemic, not only are they iron deficient, they've got no iron stores, they've also lost a lot of iron from all of the critical functions, which leads to this plethora of symptoms that these patients have and the high morbidity in this patient population. Two causes generally, lack of absorption or loss of blood. Either way, it affects the balance of iron, which is very, very finely controlled by the body. The body has no fundamental way of getting rid of excess iron, so it very, very carefully moderates absorption of iron. As I've said, caused by lack of absorption or loss of blood. A couple of the main primary diseases that go on to cause ID and IDA, inflammatory bowel disease and chronic kidney disease. Both of them have both elements there, that the general inflammation these patients have can lead to a lack of absorption, but also they have blood loss. So looking a bit more at those two indications, this is an enormous opportunity. So iron deficiency, in the broad sense in Europe, affects about 40 million people. And that covers primary care all the way through to specialty care. But just focusing on the particular ID associated with inflammatory bowel disease and chronic kidney disease, you can see here 15 million patients diagnosed with CKD or IBD in 2017, and that's growing quite strongly. It just creates an enormous opportunity because certainly in the CKD population, these patients have, by definition, it's a chronic disease, and therefore their anemia is also a chronic disease and requires chronic treatment. Of course, the treatment can be oral or it can be intravenous. So oral is probably the oldest form of treatment for this indication. There's a plethora of oral agents, but all of them are pretty much salt-based apart from Ferrocru. And that salt base leads to them being poorly absorbed. And actually, although they're inexpensive to buy, often these become the most expensive drugs you can have because they're the ones that sit on the shelf unused. And for the wide population of patients who have an issue with absorption or the intolerance to existing oral iron salts, they end up having to take intravenous iron. So, intravenous iron, it's effective in the sense that it clearly gets the iron into the patients. They don't have that issue of absorption. However, as I've said, there's a very fine balance. The body is very careful about how it controls absorption of iron. And if you go and have an IV injection, you're probably receiving a gram of iron in one go, whereas you may have 2 to 3 grams of iron in your body. So you can see it's a massive dose of iron, and iron is poisonous. Also, it's inconvenient for the patient, and generally you can only give it when the patient has anemia as well. So they've got to get ill before they get better, and then they know they're going to get ill again before they get better because their anemia is chronic to their primary disease. From a market perspective, quite an interesting dynamic. Roughly $2.5 billion opportunity at the moment, about 50-50 in revenue terms, oral to IV, about 90-10 in volume terms, oral to IV. For Ferrocru, we pitch Ferrocru as a replacement for IV iron for those patients who cannot tolerate existing oral therapies. So the price point for Ferrocru is similar to the acquisition cost of IV, but saves all the administration costs, because with IV iron, you have to go into hospitals to have it administered because of the risk of anaphylaxis. But a huge volume opportunity as well. A little bit more about Ferrocru and its mechanism of action. So Ferrocru, all the existing oral irons are salts. So you have a positive and a negative connect together. They have to dissociate in the gut for the iron to be absorbed, because as itself it's too big to absorb. The positive ion charge then causes all of the problems you have. It either agglomerates together because it's a highly effective chelating agent, or it gets involved in the redox cycle and produces free radicals, which leads to the inflammation these patients have. Ferrocru is a chelate. It's a ferric ion surrounded by three sugar molecules called maltol, with a very high binding affinity for each other. So in layman's terms, effectively, I guess it sort of creates a magnet, and they attract each other but repel everything else. However, if the patient is iron deficient, the patient's own ability to attract the iron, the patient effectively has a stronger magnet and is able to pull the iron away from the maltol and then avidly absorb it. The patient absorbs what they need from Ferrocru. Anything that's unabsorbed stays in the benign form of the chelate and passes through the gut. So you don't get hyperabsorption or overabsorption with Ferrocru, and because of the benign placebo-like profile of the drug, you get this clean pass through the gut. So really very elegant, very simple. Once absorbed, the maltol gets glucuronidated and excreted through first-pass metabolism, and the iron just goes into the normal iron transport mechanism. So it goes onto transferrin, onto ferritin, and either goes into storage or gets utilized in red cell production. How does it work in real life with the doctors? So, as I said, patient comes in with their iron deficiency indication. The doctor would normally prescribe them an existing oral iron, cheap, cheerful. If you don't have the phenotype, so to speak, that is reactive to oral iron salts, then that's the drug you should take. Cheap, cheerful, effective. However, if you're one that has the reaction, then clearly Theracru is an opportunity for these patients, and it provides them with low-dose oral iron. It's very simple, taken twice daily without food. Because of the lack of reaction you get, all existing oral irons get taken with food, and they're in much bigger doses. You get lots of the iron being available. It very effectively raises the hemoglobin and their iron scores. So it does a lot of the stuff that IV does, but without any of the risks of IV, and frankly without the cost of IV. Okay, so just moving on to a little bit of just touch very briefly on some of the data. So the first study we did with this drug was in IBD patients, the argument being that these are the most intolerant of the existing oral therapies. And if we could show that the drug worked in that population, then you could work up the value chain to the less or the more easily treated patients. 12-week placebo-controlled study, endpoint, the difference between active and placebo in their hemoglobin scores. After 12 weeks, this drug delivered a 2.3 gram difference, which was all improvement in the actively treated arm. So a really, really significant increase in their hemoglobin. And in fact, by 4 weeks of therapy, Theracru had already delivered a 1 gram improvement in these patients. Long-term data, the middle chart, shows that the patients, I said this drug doesn't get hyperabsorbed, the body ameliorates its reaction to the drug, it's the way it absorbs the drug, and you can see over a 64-week period, the hemoglobin scores normalized. Patients stayed on therapy, and in fact, in that study, the compliance rates out to 64 weeks were greater than 97%, so really, really solid data. And from a side effect basis, you see in the bottom chart, don't forget, in this study, these are patients who had active IBD. The vast majority of the reported adverse events were IBD-related adverse events. Now, you took all the adverse events together, Theracru had fewer than the placebo arm. Moving on to more recent data, the CKD study. So interesting in that this study was a 16-week placebo-controlled study. You can see that the placebo patients slightly worsened. Probably took us a bit by surprise, actually. We would have expected them to worsen a bit more. And Theracru had an excellent response out to 8 weeks and then maintained its response. When we overlay the secondary parameters, the iron parameters of this study, we can see that they continue. So the hypothesis is that in these patients who were stage 3, stage 4 CKD, actually they ran out of endogenous erythropoietin. And synthetic EPO was clearly banned from the study. But the secondary iron scores show that the drug continued to be avidly absorbed throughout the course of the study. And indeed, over the 52 weeks, you can see that the patients improved and then maintained their levels. And indeed, the placebo patients is a sort of a study within a study that you can see that their reaction to Theracru once turned onto active treatment mirrored that of the active arm in the placebo period of the study. Okay, so just very briefly on our licensing activities. So I've talked already about Norgine, European Union, Australia, New Zealand. Took an 11 million upfront from them with the ability for another 54.5 million in milestones, which are both development and sales. And then royalties ranging from 25 to 40%, which are clearly stepped. But delighted with the terms of that transaction. Norgine, why? European-centric, a commercialization business. Theracru needed share of voice, and we fundamentally believe that Norgine is a key asset for them, can give it that share of voice. We retain responsibility for manufacturing, IP, and all development globally. Just coming towards the end, so US, clearly the NDA is the big ticket here. So for Theracru, we submitted it in September, and the PDUFA date is the 27th of July. Everybody who's worked with the FDA know it's an iterative process, so we'll just have to see how that plays out. but they assess efficacy, safety, and your ability to make the drug. The drug's already approved in Europe, so clearly we have a positive outlook on this. Just touch on financial headlines. So we've given in a trading update last week that we had revenues last year of 11.9 million, and we left the year with just under 10 million pounds in cash, which gives us plenty of cash through into 2020. We're a pretty small business, so outside of our existing clinical trial portfolio, we've got pretty low costs. News flow. We have another supplementary study just coming to the end, which we expect to report by the end of this year. This is by the end of Q1. This is a comparison of Theracru to the leading IV product, which has sales of knocking on $1 billion a year, called Ferinject. It's a non-inferiority study. So we're looking to see that these two drugs can be compared with each other, and then obviously get all the advantages of the oral therapy. I've talked about the PDUFA date, and we'll be starting a pediatric study in the second half of the year. Of course, we're looking at other opportunities for out-licensing. So, in summary, iron deficiency is a really interesting opportunity, significant unmet medical need in these patients, and there are an enormous number of patients. Theracru, simple with a large market opportunity. Great patent protection out till the mid-30s. We have an excellent cash runway, and like probably every CEO, I think the company's undervalued. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.